All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this evening, everyone. I'm here with Scott Walker, and I'll introduce him now. Scott Walker is a longtime resident of Fredericksburg and has worked for Stafford County Schools for over 30 years. He has served on the board for the Historic Fredericksburg Foundation and for Friends of Chatham Manor. He is a member of multiple historic groups, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He has been a president of the Civil War Roundtable of Fredericksburg, and the owner of Hallowed Ground Stores in Fredericksburg. His talk on Maury has been continuously updated and researched and been presented at both the Library of Congress and the Library of Virginia. Thanks for joining us tonight, Scott. I'll let you take it away.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Maury is a subject that, as I get into it, many of us at least know the name, but don't necessarily know about him. And in fact, back in his day, at first, no one knew him. In 1844, a Captain Brown had sailed from Baltimore to Brazil with a load of flour and brought back some Brazilian coffee. He did it in a record time, cutting half the time of a normal voyage. How did you do it? Everyone asked. He said, I used the charts of Matthew Fontaine Maury. Now, Maury, at that point, had just been appointed superintendent of the Naval Observatory in Washington. Nobody knew him. Some Navy people did, but this captain had decided to capitalize on Maury's knowledge and his output from that observatory. The man, of course, there was no public electronic medium, so you had some photographs, some paintings. All of these are various images of Maury in the 1840s and 50s. Here, of course, complex near my house, the former elementary school, Maury School, sits in Spotsylvania County. There is a marker of his birth site. It's 12 miles from Fredericksburg, about, say, 5 or 6 miles from the Salem branch of the library. It sits in the middle of the Chancellorsville Battlefield. There was a prominent statue of Maury in Richmond on Monument Avenue. That's what has particularly changed in the past year and a half. He was there among all the statues of the people who were involved with the Confederacy, as was he in the Civil War. He, though, to me, always stood out as different. The other guys were soldiers or politicians. He was not a soldier and definitely not a politician. He's a scientist, and here was a statue to him. So that always puzzled a lot of people. And now, of course, he's being reconsidered in that light because his statue has been removed, as have many of the others. That's not the topic of the talk, but it is part of the talk that has changed. Maury, after a certain age, was forgotten, and I just began to look at him again approximately 12 years ago. He was called the Pathfinder of the Seas. We'll see why that was given to him. But no matter what we say, as a community with various aspects of Maury around us, we don't know him. It's not just here. A lot of people don't know him. I first learned about Maury a couple of years ago, as many of you of a certain age in elementary school in Virginia. This was the 4th grade Virginia history book. Essentially, it started at Jamestown and went forward. But in it were chapters on various famous Virginians, many from the 19th century. And Maury's chapter called him the Pathfinder of the Seas. I reread this every few times I give this talk because it's a very simplistic and childlike version of his life, but yet the basics are there that he was born in Spotsylvania County in 1806 on that spot of that marker. it begins an association with names from that era because the farm was originally owned by Light Horse Harry Lee, who was Robert E. Lee's father. There was all of that in Spotsylvania County. And by the way, it was a tobacco farm. It was not successful. So Maury's father picked up and moved the entire family by wagon to Franklin, Tennessee. That's Middle Tennessee, south of Nashville. They rode in a wagon or walked in 1810 to Tennessee. He grew up there. The family was, I wouldn't call them dirt poor, but they didn't have a lot of niceties. But the father believed in education. He tried to get his kids into various schools. Here's where Matthew Maury began to show something that others didn't have. He immediately took to mathematics. In fact, he at the school and academy that was nearby, he taught others, and that's where he began to earn a little money. When he was 19 years old, over his father's objections, he received an appointment as a midshipman in the U.S. Navy. Now, he's in Tennessee. He does not have an ocean around him. He's born in Spotsylvania County. There's no ocean. Why was he attracted? Well, his brother had been in the Navy. The brother had fought in the War of 1812. He'd fought pirates. Regrettably, the brother died of a fever and was buried at sea, but he was a hero to young Matthew. And the father, though, didn't want to send another son off, but Matt persuaded him. And here's another one of those connections to someone from the 19th century. He received the appointment. And by the way, there was no Naval Academy at this point. You got appointed by your congressman. His congressman in Tennessee was Sam Houston. He then walked, and that's no joke, from Franklin, Tennessee to get to Washington, D.C. He walked up the Valley of Virginia. I'll give you the idea of modern Route 11. He had money from teaching math to people at that school, with which he bought a horse and had a little left over and told the guy he'd send him more money when he got to Washington. He later did that. He kept his word. He and another man sort of hitchhiked and walked on the same horse. He then crosses, goes to Charlottesville, where he has Fontaine relatives, Matthew Fontaine Maury. He then travels to an uncle's house in Spotsylvania County, where Nye River Reservoir is today. And that was an interesting visit because he met a cousin, Anne, and in those days you could fall in love with your cousin. And he never forgot Anne that he met on this walk to try to get to Washington. Now, he then goes across through Fredericksburg and across to what is now modern Belle Plains Landing and got on the first boat he'd ever been on, a steamboat that took him to Washington. He then began a series of voyages with the Navy. The first one actually took Lafayette back to France. He then was on an exploring voyage. He then was on the first vessel to sail around the globe, U.S. naval vessel. So he was always sailing. In 1934, he returned to Spotsylvania to marry that cousin, Anne Herndon, and that's a local name. Herndons were connected with what we call today it's Foodie. It was the bank in Fredericksburg. But the problem is, in those days, when he wasn't sailing, he went on half pay. That was a Navy method. So he actually had to somehow support his family. And he wrote pamphlets and tracts, and they were scientific and they were well received. He gained notice immediately for his mind, and he began to write about navigation. Unfortunately, in 1939, he had a severe injury on a stagecoach journey. It broke a leg. He was lame for the rest of his life, and that ended his career at sea. He recovered in Fredericksburg, where he and his wife had a small house on what is Charlotte Street. Essentially, he underwent physical therapy, but he continued writing. I include Foodie today. That's Anne Herndon's family. But some of what he wrote was critical of the U.S. Navy. So he wrote under the name Anonymous. He had much time off, and that's hard to explain. They just didn't have many ships. But when you were off the ship, you got half pay. So that's why he was doing all this writing. He contributed to a significant magazine in Richmond. It was edited by a guy you've heard of, Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote some of these articles about the Navy as scraps from the Lucky Bag. Lucky Bag was like the lost and found on a ship. And he used the name Harry Bluff, but some of his friends realized it was him writing because they'd heard him talking. And he was suggesting things that he felt would make the Navy better. So this is all in the 1830s, including the time with his injury. While he was here, one of the jobs he took was superintendent of the gold mine up the Rappahannock River, and he became superintendent simply by reading a book and learning how to get gold out of the ore. Unfortunately, that means he was the first one to befoul the Rappahannock River with mercury, because that's how they did it. Here are some of the things that he recommended that people began to take notice of. Many of them came to pass. He recommended there be a naval yard at Pensacola, Florida. Of course, we all know that's there today. He saw that. He wrote articles that trying to get the Navy to convert steamships instead of sailing vessels. He saw and spoke out for the need of a naval academy, just like West Point for the Army. As he continued writing the rest of his life, he also developed navigational ideas that, whether you realize it or not, you still use them. Instead of taking a straight sailing line from, say, New York to Liverpool, it's really faster and safer to take, in those days, the Great Circle Line. In other words, up and over, and airplanes still do that today. If you are at Dulles International Airport headed for Europe, you fly routes in the air on the Great Circle idea that he developed in the ocean in the 1840s. He developed ocean lanes like interstate highways, but for ships. Coming Norfolk, Charleston, and New York and Boston still use the ocean lanes that he charted for ships exiting and entering their ports. He also figured out that there was a way to run a cable across the shallowest part of the North Atlantic. He didn't run it, but Cyrus Field, who gets credit for doing that, laying the Atlantic cable to Great Britain, consulted with Maury as he tried to find the way to get on the sea floor over to Great Britain. He also said we should put a railroad, and of course it became a canal through Panama. These are things that Maury's mind was sensing and that he wrote about. He also pointed out the need for transcontinental railroad on North America. And with that and ocean sailing, he also developed the idea of something that we still use, our time zones. So this guy was always thinking as he was in the Navy. And then in 1844, he got his big break. His injury meant he couldn't sail anymore, but he became the first superintendent of the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. The building still stands. There's a newer one now, but this one is near today's Kennedy Center. It was the center of naval of the naval navigation series that all captains used. And whenever they sailed, they would turn in their ship's logs, and they had been turning them into the predecessor of this Observatory. It was just an office of instruments. And he had access to all of these old ship's logs. And he started reading through them, and he realized there were common things at different times of the year in the different oceans of the world. And that's when he began this development of these huge charts that showed the best way to get through the different oceans at different times of the year. He developed tide charts, wind charts, and of course, whale charts, which were important in the middle 19th century, helped that industry. He became so renowned, and that's the only word for it, that the rest of the world took notice. And he put together an international conference in Brussels that got all the ship's captains of the world to keep the records that U.S. ship captains kept. And thus his influence in world shipping was huge. In 1855, he published a book called Physical Geography of the Sea. In essence, it was the first textbook of oceanography. He was just laying out facts and ideas about the oceans of the world. And of course, all of us are familiar with the fact that there's more ocean than land. Then in 1861, the key element in his biography, he opted with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. We're going to talk more about all of that. He then had a post-Civil War project in Mexico before he returned to be a professor of physics at V.M.I, Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, where in 1873 he died. Now that's a quick overview of his biography, but particularly here in the 1840s and 50s were the things that gave Matthew Fontaine Maury, this guy born in the middle of the wilderness in Spotsylvania County, that the world took notice of everything he was writing and, in fact, everything he was saying. While he was superintendent, this is what the building looked like. He was able to figure what it should be. The observatory part, you think today, well, why was it there? It actually was in a good spot for as far as Washington goes, but it's here that everybody would report to him with their observations. But he then created, if you look at the picture in the middle on the far left, they actually moved him and his family there. They'd been living on today Upper Pennsylvania Avenue. And so this became his home by the 1840s and 50s. Everybody in the Navy who wanted to understand navigation knew that he was the guy that they needed to study under. This is what the building looks like today. It's no longer an active Navy building, but because it has such history, they do use it as a museum, not just for navigation, but actually for naval medicine. But it is still there. He got the title Pathfinder of the Seas because he did so much with regard to ocean navigation. He developed these charts, not just of currents, but of wind. And you would have with each chart sort of an instruction book that he called Sailing Directions. I'll show you a few more of the charts, but you can see they have specific pathways outlined on them. The whale maps were a great help to the New England shipping industry. And you can see he wasn't, though he was a naval officer, he generally dressed in civilian clothes. This is a chart of the Indian Ocean. You can see they're large. And unfortunately, I had another small chart behind it. So if I'm going to the next slide that you can see, this is sailing directions. You see the top line? You had to have this with each chart, or you wouldn't understand the chart. So he was publishing maps, charts, and books out of the Naval Observatory. This is one of his products that my wife and I were able to see when I was at the Library of Congress. This is an 1860 map of the United States with every county outlined. In other words, Spotsylvania County is on here if we could see that in an enlargement. The interesting thing about this map, down where it says the Washington map of the United States, there in the lower left, it also says Matthew F. Maury, comma, Superintendent, U.S. Naval Observatory, 1860. There's an 1862 version of this. It's virtually the same map, and it says U.S. Naval Observatory, but it's like they've taken white out down in the lower left-hand corner. Of course, whiteout's a modern product, and they just sort of erased his name because at that point, of course, he'd gone over to the Confederacy. But this is a huge, I mean, it's 10 feet by 10 feet. And every county that then existed in what were the states of the United States. In 1855, Congress created what was called the Retirement Board for the United States Navy. People, really 20 years after he first started writing about suggestions for the U.S. Navy, they then began to take some of his suggestions, not realizing that he had done it at first, and they began to put them into effect. Well, guess what? Because he'd made some of these suggestions, and this is what I mean, he wasn't a politician, people got mad at him. And though he wasn't really dismissed and he wasn't a full officer, he was placed on reserve, but they still wanted him at the Naval Observatory because he was actually one of their stars. He complained to Congress. In other words, he said, hey, you can't do that to me. And he had so many friends in Congress that the decision about him was reversed. But this put him on the wrong side of several senators. Those three you see there, the Davis, of course, is Jefferson Davis, who later became the president of the Confederacy, who had to work with Maury again. Mallory from Florida was Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy. He too suddenly had to work with Maury. And guess what? It was not a good relationship. Throughout his career, there were these professional conflicts. It wasn't that he was hard to get along with. In fact, most people who knew him really talked about he was a very personable and, of course, knowledgeable man. I think part of it is he got people so upset with him. He remained a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, even though he went in 1925 for almost until 1859, and then he was upgraded to commander. Many people didn't like his scientific background, and folks, as I've gone through this, he had no college background. He wasn't truly self-taught. He had other people that helped him, but I'm trying to say he wasn't an academic scientist. And of course, the doctorate people and the college people didn't like him. They felt he wasn't worthy, I guess. Now, I use this term, AMP, absent-minded professor. He was kind of forgetful. He didn't care about some of the niceties. He didn't care about when I say politics, the small p politic things that maybe if someone who was a senator who helped fund your observatory, you should be nicer to. But he didn't understand that. In spite of all this, though, every young officer wanted to serve under Maury at the observatory because they knew that he knew what he was talking about. Now, for those of us of a certain age, we remember in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, the U.S. Navy was converting to nuclear power. And the guy who really understood that was Admiral Hyman Rickover. Now, I don't know that his personality and Maury's matched. Rickover was a very direct man, and he had a prickly personality. He was hard to work with, but every naval officer wanted to serve under Rickover because they knew he was knowledgeable about nuclear power. That's the same of these guys back in the 1850s who knew that Maury understood navigation. He also sent them on exploring expeditions. This is the era when vast parts of South America, Antarctica, Asia, and Africa really needed mapping. And he sent his young guys off to do that. In other words, he was developing those details as well as ocean maps. Well, then came April 1861. Like Robert E. Lee, the story of Maury pacing the floor to decide whether he had to, what he was going to stay a U.S. naval officer or go and join the Confederacy. But in Maury's writing about it, you pick up something that I don't know the full story of Robert E. Lee, but Maury knew that if he resigned and went to work with the Confederacy, it was a treasonous act. He seemed to understand, and he wrote about that. So that was part of his pacing back and forth in the Naval Observatory that night. Well, they left Washington and came to Fredericksburg, where he left his family, and he went on to Richmond. This angered many of the people who admired him. And in Boston, you see this newspaper that posted bounties like a wanted poster. And Maury, and I can't emphasize the word more, he was world renowned. He'd received recognition and awards from the leaders of the countries of Europe, of Russia. The Pope had awarded him these medals. He was known worldwide. The U.S. knew he was admired. They like it, that because that was good for this country. But boy, here he goes over to the Confederacy, and that made people very angry. What did he do? Well, he first goes to Richmond, and at the beginning of the Civil War, you have to understand the Confederacy was first the group of states that seceded early, and then states like Virginia that were just in the process of doing that. So the army in Virginia at first wasn't a Confederate army, the Virginia one. And that's what Maury helped develop. He was the committee of three. Well, one of the other people was Lee. Other man was the commander of V.M.I. He was given assignments to deal with naval things, harbors, rivers, to create coastal defenses. So he was put right to work on things he should have known. But here's the thing. He began experimenting with what was called torpedoes. Now, in those days, that was the name applied to what we know as mines, exploding things in the water. His family here in Fredericksburg stayed at a house that still stands on Lower Caroline Street. And if you go by and see it, next to it, there's the separate kitchen, because this put so many people in the house. His aunt lived there, Mary Minor Blackford. She had a large family. He had a large family. It spilled over into what we see as the brick kitchen. Every Monday morning, he got on the train and went to Richmond to work for the government and to experiment on torpedoes. He stayed at a cousin's house in Richmond, and then every Friday came back. I guess it was the VRE in reverse back in the 1860s. His children scattered. The boys, one was first in what was called the Virginia Provisional Army, and another one, strangely enough, was assigned to an army that wound up in Vicksburg, and he literally disappeared off the face of the earth. He wasn't involved in a battle or a skirmish or an engagement. He just disappeared. Maury made an appeal to the Union commander, who was Ulysses Grant. nobody could find out any information on the son that just disappeared. So the effects of war began to take effect on his family. He continued to experiment with these torpedoes, which this is a great contemporary drawing of it. He both experimented in the bathtub in his cousin's house and then the James River near Richmond at what is called Rockets Landing. You can still drive by Rockets Landing. Uh, they they didn't understand how to get them to detonate underwater and be controlled by electricity. Electricity was still sort of a new thing, but he just kept at it to improve mines. Now, the Union's Secretary of the Navy said that more ships, Union ships, were destroyed by mines, Confederate mines or torpedoes, than any other method. So Maury did his work really well. He also developed very small, heavily armed boats that were called, nicknamed Maury boats or mosquito boats. Now, this is a drawing of one, and look at it closely. There's a gun in the very front and in the back. And while he developed this, but to me, as the more I looked at it, it had the same look from a World War II torpedo boat. Now, Maury didn't invent PT boats, but do you see a small, heavily armed, fast boat? That is what Maury was trying to do here with these small boats. Well, his demeanor, in spite of his knowledge, angered people. It angered the politicians. Remember that he'd made mad back in the 1850s. And the way they dealt with him was to send the problem away. They sent him to England with a specific assignment, which was to represent the Confederacy. Because here's a world-renowned man that is a Confederate that would make the Confederacy look good. He reported to a man you may have heard about, James Bullock, who was the agent for the Confederacy in Great Britain. He's the one who was trying to outfit these raiding boats. Now, Maury's main assignment was to be the representative of the Confederacy to other European governments. He traveled frequently to France. He went to Germany. In other words, the world-renowned man is a Confederate, so that meant the Confederacy must be good. This was in the era when they were trying to get European recognition. He wrote many pieces, what we would call op-ed, or letters to the editor, to try to persuade people to support the Confederacy. He did assist outfitting some of those raiding ships, particularly one called the Georgia. So he had active Confederate service even after he was sent away. But when the war ended, his family was afraid for him to come back to the U.S. because they figured he'd be hung, frankly. So he went to Mexico and did something that I don't know if many people have heard about. He created colonies that Archduke Maximilian, who was the Austrian that took over the government in Mexico, and he invited Confederates to come there. He called the places New Virginia and Carlotta, who was Maximilian's wife. And his son came, a couple of Confederate generals, including John Bankhead Magruder. And they were only mildly successful, but it was trying to be sort of an outlet for people who didn't want to remain in the United States. He knew he needed more support, so he sailed back to England, which of course where he was well received. But while he was there, Maximilian was overthrown, and Maury has nothing to do. Now, he wrote and got his family to England. They hadn't seen him for several years. He supported his family by writing geography books for children. They became well known and much used throughout the late 19th century. he was trying to, frankly, make geography interesting instead of very textbook oriented. So that was his effort after he lost all his jobs when Maximilian was not just overthrown, but executed. He returned to this country and becomes the professor of physics at V.M.I. in Lexington, Virginia. He continued, because of his stature, to lecture nationwide. At this point, it wasn't the oceans he'd already at least gotten people to understand charts, but he was beginning to lecture on weather, meteorology, because he felt if people understood weather, it would help the farmers of the nation. He successfully worked to establish what was called Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College. That's modern Virginia Tech. In 1872, it was created Virginia Polytechnic Institute. And now that's Virginia Tech. He wrote a book called Physical Survey of Virginia, which in essence it was an economic development book, trying to get really Northerners or other people worldwide to invest in Virginia, to show them what was there. People and perhaps natural resources, to try to get people to bring their businesses and money to Virginia to help it recover from the war. He died in Lexington in 1873, initially buried there, and then moved to Richmond, where his marker stands today. And as you can see, it does say he was born in Spotsylvania County. Everybody in the 19th century seemed to have last words. It was important. His last words were "all is well," which is a shipboard statement at night, meaning everything's okay, smooth sailing. So he used that phrase even as he died. He's buried near James Monroe's grave. James Monroe was president when Maury entered the Navy, and also next to Maury is a grave of John Tyler, President John Tyler of Virginia, who was president when Maury established the Naval Observatory. Memorials were created. We're going to talk more about the statue in Richmond, but that was 1929. There was a small monument and Maury Circle in Washington. It's near the State Department. There is a bust of Maury in the current Naval Observatory, and there's been a series of naval vessels named for Maury. The last two were scientific vessels, including the latest one in 2013. An interesting aspect of the Monument Avenue statue, on the left is a photograph from a 1922 biography of Maury. It had the plaster cast of the statue that later went up. This entire plaster cast was in the library here in Fredericksburg in Maury Elementary School, the building that today is Maury Commons. And as Maury School closed, they had a huge, what amounted to a yard sale. And this was just scattered to the four winds. And I have a friend downtown who has the top of it on his bookshelf. So this was the model for the statue in Richmond. He was elected into the Hall of Fame. Building at V.M.I, where he taught, is named for him. There is actually a Naval Academy building with Maury on it. This is the Mahan Complex. The whole right-hand side in the doorway there is the Maury building, where they teach electrical engineering, and it has this plaque. And I find it interesting that before all of the recent discussions, it acknowledged, as you see, yes, he was superintendent of the Naval Observatory, but it actually acknowledged his Confederate service. The Old building now has some displays about Maury. The new building up on Mass Avenue is still used and a functioning part of the U.S. Navy. And on the left, you see the bust of Maury. There is a huge state of Virginia monument beyond Lexington in Goshen Pass, a very beautiful topographical pass through the mountains. See the huge anchor that's there? And get this, in 1924, there began something that every January on his birth date, the state celebrated Maury Day, and there was no school. Kids got off from school. I cannot find out when that ended. I mean, I know it wasn't when I was in school or when I worked in the school system, but you got to pass for a day because of Maury. Other things are named for him in that part of the country. Section of the North River became Maury, the highway. Every home he lived in Lexington, the one on what they don't use the word campus, but on the post or grounds of V.M.I, that building is noted. There's a marker at another building that he called a home. So he has these markers all over the place. Well, what about here where he was born? In Fredericksburg, we have a street. It's 1 block long. It's near the canal at the bottom of the Washington Avenue Boulevard section. And then there's this strange marker in the ground, and it used to look like this, and it's on Charlotte Street. And it in effect marks the home that he and his wife lived in whenever he was off the ship and having to write. He came to Fredericksburg and lived. This is what it looked like. It was destroyed in the 1950s. It existed till then. A scrap yard and a Chevrolet dealership went in there. It's where today the post office has the parking lot for its vehicles. Notice it's a duplex. In the tradition of family societies at that time, not only did Maury and his growing family live here, but on the other side lived his late brother John's wife and children. The brother who died at sea. You took care of your own siblings' families. This house was one of several that were destroyed in the 1950s that created a spark of, wait a minute, we can't keep tearing this old stuff down, that led to the establishment of the Historic Fredericksburg Foundation, HFFI, our local preservation group. Of course, today the school is turned into condominiums. The sports field is called Maury Field. We do have that. The birthplace site is there. The site of the house is merely a site. The house no longer exists. But of course, the problem with anything in Fredericksburg, if you turn from this stone 180 degrees, there's development right up to it. But it is at least protected within the park. The good news about the stone in the ground by the post office is, and this is what it used to look like. It was merely a stone there next between the sidewalk and the fence. But the local camp or branch of the Sons of Confederate Veterans installed this in 2013 to at least give it a little more protection and give Maury some recognition. By the way, the branches of each Sons group are called camps, and the Fredericksburg camp is the Matthew Fontaine Maury camp. Very nice complex that they put together there. Maury School, the city installed a historic marker. We've done that a lot in various things within the city. And this has some biographical information about Maury, that he was born in Spotsylvania. In other words, to explain why the place was called Maury. Maury's family were Huguenots, that is, French Protestants who were persecuted, fled France to North America through England. He's a double Huguenot. Both the Fontaines and the Maurys were Huguenots. They put this stone next to his grave marker in 2013. I was honored to speak at that event. It's just very full recognition of his lineage. And in 2013, this ship was launched by the U.S. Navy. It's a oceanographic research vessel. It was launched in Mississippi, so it's part of the U.S. Navy fleet. Here is a great story that I'm essentially ending on. Remember that Maury's charts helped ships everywhere, and he was given honorary membership in several, but two that we've come to know about: the Marine Society of Salem and another group in Salem. Now, a Marine Society was created by the captains and owners of ships. It's a way that would take care of the families of the sailors lost at sea. Maury's charts helped. I mean, it's pure capitalism. It meant ships could go safer and faster. They could get more cargo that they could sell, and they didn't have as many, say, claims on a sunken ship because they were using Maury's chart. And these societies made Maury honorary members, and he gave them sets of charts. I love their motto, which I put there at the bottom. In other words, they're taking care of the families of people lost at sea. In 2006, a group of Fredericksburg folks from what is now the Washington Heritage Museum were in New England, frankly, to see leaves, New England leaf color. And they came back through Salem. We're staying at the Hawthorne Hotel. On the roof is the meeting room of the Marine Society of Salem, who had in the 1920s had sold the land to the hotel with the agreement that they could have the meeting room on the roof forever, in perpetuity. Here it is. It's in the shape of a ship's cabin. It's a great place. They have exhibits. The portrait is of a New England navigation expert pre-Maury, Nathaniel Bowditch. But because it's a small place, these folks went up and came down just gasping, my goodness, we found a portrait of Matthew Fontaine Maury up there, but guess what? It's turned to the wall. What do you mean turned to the wall? Well, in investigating this is the phrase from the minutes of the society in 1861 about Maury. And notice it says, picture reversed and hung in our room head down. Reversed and upside down was a 19th century form of disrespect. In Virginia, we have an example of that. By the way, here's the picture in still the Salem Marine Society meeting room. General George Thomas was a Virginian who was an outstanding Union general. But in his family home near Norfolk, guess what they did? They kept his photo or his portrait, but they hung it upside down. It was just a way to disgrace someone. A group of us found us out and decided we'd ask the Salem Marine Society, well, could we give you a real portrait of Maury that you'd hang front and center? After all, he was important to you. He was important to the world. And we found a portrait at the current Naval Observatory had in their Maury exhibit. And this is the one that we then gave to the Salem Marine Society in 2008, where it hangs now in the bulwark next to the turned over one. And underneath, we have a short explanation of Maury and the issue of turning something to the wall. Well, here's a guy who did a lot 150 years ago and then actually was mostly forgotten. For whatever reason, we can't truly say. What is his legacy? Well, he vastly improved and developed navigation. There's no way to deny that, whether he is a Union guy or Confederate guy. He's the guy that brought navigation from out of the Stone Age, from just dead reckoning, to making ships, what I said earlier about the Marine Society, safer and faster. He had a vision for the Navy. He was saying that early on. He was saying that in the 1830s. Then, of course, you get the modern reconsideration that how do you decide, does his Confederate service mean that he shouldn't be given recognition? Folks, I can't answer that. And what I want to make clear, I'm not trying to get into the discussion of statues or not. But of course, the statues are what brought Maury back to it. I tried to put this in balance. In other words, a timeline of his life. And then I tried to list all the things he did at different times of his life. But for all he did there on the left, I want to go over to the X's. Remember, I said he sent all those guys exploring throughout the world. Well, what he also was doing was looking for a place that perhaps as an outlet for slaves and slave owners. This is pre-Civil War. I mean, he was already looking to keep slavery and expand it. He did all those things with the Confederacy. He himself did not own slaves, by the way. We do know that. But he had stern views of that slavery was a positive thing. He had negative views that he published of attitudes toward Black Americans, enslaved or free. And he has all that in writing. So on the left are all the things he did. At the bottom, I put the last few things he did. And I guess I don't have an answer for it. This quote, until the 1930s, was in the margin of charts used by the United States Navy. They acknowledged him. And I think in closing, I want to give you a quote from that book that I said was the first oceanographic book. He understood the oceans. So thank you for listening, and I will take any questions if Michelle will help me navigate out of it.
Yep, not a problem. So, folks, if you want to put your questions down in the comments below, we'll try to go through what we have time for. And speaking right now, we do have plenty of time. One moment.
And maybe there are no questions.
Okay, let me go ahead and read off some of the comments that we do have. Joe says, hello from the wilderness. Lynn says he was a Renaissance person, integrating science into the material world, and much forgotten, like Alexander von Humboldt.
Who Maury corresponded with, by the way.
So we'll wait a minute or so to let people put in some comments if they have anything. If not, we'll wrap up and thank everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you from me too.
And Spotsylvania County Government says, thanks for a very educational and informative presentation. Thank you, Spotsylvania. So I guess, Mike, I have a question for you. In researching him, did you come across really a favorite story or kind of just interesting tidbit?
Well, first of all, his productive life, say from the time he joined the Navy until his death, there's all sorts of things he did. But I think I found it interesting. He always seemed to be connected to Fredericksburg. But I think the human parts of the man were shown with his family there in Washington in the Naval Observatory. And while this isn't a story, it's a favorite moment. In touring that facility, you can see where his daughter, with a diamond, etched their names in the glass in the window, and it's still there.
Very neat. We do have a question. Bonnie asks, do any of his descendants live in this area? Do you know?
I know of one descendant who I am in contact with who lives in Chesterfield County, Virginia. It's his great great granddaughter.
Okay, and Peter asks, have you seen the newsreel short on Maury done in the 1930s? Turner
Yes.
Classic Movies has shown it several times.
Oh, several times. I mean, it's like the little textbook I showed you. He did so much. And I'm not trying to say you always need to look at the other things he did with the Confederacy, but of course that's never mentioned in any of his biographies except as a heroic thing. So yeah, I've seen that. It is what it is.
All right,
And
folks,
it'll never go away, I guess.
Folks, we still have some time if anyone has any last questions.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Oh, Bonnie said she had to pause for a minute. She didn't hear the answer about the descendants in the area.
One great 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 granddaughter lives near Richmond. I mean, there may be others. She is in contact. Well, she has a sister, and that's the family descendants I know. Property that he involved with his family is still here in King George County. Of course, his birthplace is National Park Service property. And the home site doesn't exist downtown, but many of his relatives in the Herndon line, his wife's line, there are still buildings in Fredericksburg where they lived. They still stand.
Another comment. R. Ann says, very interesting, informative. Thank you. So I think with that, we'll wrap up, folks. Thanks, Jen, for joining us, and tune in next month with the first Thursday. We'll be doing another Spotsylvania 300 lecture. Thanks again. Bye-bye.